Hey there, mystery seekers. Today we're traveling to a country smaller than South Carolina that somehow managed to become the paranormal capital of Europe, the Czech Republic. A place where medieval builders constructed castles not to keep enemies out, but to keep something in. Where Nazi occultists ran secret experiments during World War II. Where hunters report their rifles literally melting when they get too close to, well, something in the mountains. And where a poet allegedly traveled through time and wrote about it in 1836. Yeah, we're going there. Here's the thing. Most people visit Prague for the beer and the Instagram shots of Charles Bridge. What they don't realize is they're walking through one of the most concentrated zones of unexplained phenomena on the planet. Ancient meteorite impacts, bottomless pits that locals call gates to hell, crop circles appearing overnight with mathematical precision, and UFO sightings so frequent that serious researchers now track this region like storm chasers track tornadoes. Coincidence? Maybe. But after today, you might not be so sure. So before we dive into this rabbit hole together, smash that like button if you're into the weird and wonderful, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from tonight? I genuinely want to know which corner of the world is joining me on this journey into the unknown. Comfortable? Good. Let's begin. Now, if you want to understand why the Czech Republic seems to attract the strange and unexplained like a magnet attracts iron filings, you need to go back. Way back. About 15 million years back, give or take a few thousand centuries. Picture this. A peaceful Miocene afternoon in what would eventually become southern Germany. Primitive deer grazing on quiet grasslands. Early giraffes doing whatever early giraffes did. And then, without so much as a polite warning, a chunk of space rock roughly a kilometer wide comes screaming out of the southwest at 20 kilometers per second. That is about 72,000 kilometers per hour for those keeping score at home, which is considerably faster than your morning commute, no matter how late you are running. What happened next makes every disaster movie you have ever seen look like a gentle sneeze. The impact released energy equivalent to 40 million Hiroshima bombs going off simultaneously. 40 million. The roar circled the entire planet. Everything within 100 kilometers was vaporized, incinerated, or otherwise having a very bad day. The crater that formed, now known as the Nordlinger Ries, stretches 24 kilometers across and remains visible to this day. In fact, there is a charming German town called Nordlingen built right inside it, which is either a testament to human resilience or a spectacular failure of real estate due diligence. The locals apparently looked at a massive hole punched in the earth by a cosmic projectile and thought, you know what this needs? A church and some nice restaurants. But here is where things get interesting for our purposes. When that asteroid slammed into Bavaria at an angle somewhere between 30 and 50 degrees, it did not just leave a hole. It created something far more peculiar. The impact melted everything. The asteroid itself, the rocks beneath, the very ground for miles around. This molten material was blasted hundreds of kilometers into the upper atmosphere, where it cooled rapidly while still airborne, forming droplets and teardrops of greenish glass. These fragments rained down across a specific corridor stretching northeast from the impact site, landing primarily in what is now the Czech Republic. Scientists call them tektites. The locals call them Moldavites, named after the Vltava River, known in German as the Moldau. And for 15 million years, these cosmic tears have been scattered across Bohemia like emerald confetti at history's most violent party. Now, Moldavite is not your average rock. It is technically not even a mineral since it lacks the organized crystal structure that defines true minerals. It is an amorphous solid, frozen chaos from the moment of creation. Under a microscope, you can see that the silica molecules never had time to arrange themselves properly. They were too busy being launched into the stratosphere and then plummeting back to Earth. The result is a forest green to olive-colored glass with distinctive furrows and surface etching, the marks of 14 million years of acidic groundwater slowly sculpting each piece. Some specimens have an almost poisonous blue-green tint that collectors describe as acrid, which is a fancy way of saying it looks like something you definitely should not eat. What makes this relevant to our story of Czech mysteries is what some people believe happened as a result of this ancient cataclysm. According to certain theorists, and I should note that mainstream geologists would probably prefer I did not mention this next part, the impact created more than just pretty green rocks. It created an energy field. An enormous, invisible network of power points and force lines crisscrossing the Czech lands like some kind of cosmic circuit board. The country, they argue, is literally saturated with places of power. Some heal, some terrify. Some do both, depending on the day of the week and possibly your astrological sign. Is this scientifically proven? Well, that depends entirely on how loose your definition of science is. But what is undeniably true is that the Czech Republic has an unusual concentration of locations that people have considered special, sacred, or outright dangerous for thousands of years. Prehistoric peoples used moldavite fragments for tools and talismans as far back as 40,000 years ago. That is during the Upper Paleolithic, when Neanderthals were still around and fashion consisted primarily of not dying. These early humans apparently recognized something valuable in these cosmic glasses and went to considerable trouble to collect and work them. Some were even used in burial rituals, suggesting our distant ancestors believed moldavite had powers beyond the merely decorative. And here is where the geology gets genuinely strange even by conventional standards. The Czech Republic sits on some remarkably complex ground. Geothermal measurements from over 350 deep boreholes have mapped a landscape of varying heat flows, with some regions showing temperatures that climb to over 40 degrees Celsius at just 1 kilometer depth. The western regions around Karlovy Vary can expect temperatures reaching 170 degrees at 5 kilometers down. There are radon zones, particularly in the Šumava Mountains, where radioactive gas seeps naturally from the earth. There are deposits of gold, uranium, and other minerals that create what some researchers describe as unusual electromagnetic conditions. Whether any of this translates to mystical energy is, of course, a matter of considerable debate. But it does mean the ground beneath Czech feet is anything but ordinary. Speaking of unusual ground, let us talk about what people did when they encountered places that felt wrong. Because throughout history, Czech lands have been dotted with locations that made people deeply uncomfortable. Caves that seemed to breathe, crevices that emitted strange sounds, clearings in forests where animals refused to go and birds fell silent. The logical response, you might think, would be to fill these places with concrete, cover them with dirt, and pretend they never existed. Maybe put up a nice parking lot. Problem solved. Everyone goes home happy. But that is not what medieval builders did, not even close. Instead, they developed a philosophy that strikes the modern mind as either profoundly wise or completely insane, depending on your perspective. They believed that some forms of darkness could not be destroyed. They could only be contained. And so, across the Czech lands, and indeed across much of medieval Europe, an architectural tradition emerged that makes absolutely no sense unless you accept its underlying premise: that evil needed to be sealed, not eliminated, and that sacred buildings could serve as cosmic locks. The logic, if we can call it that, went something like this. Certain places were inherently dangerous because they connected to something beyond normal reality. Maybe they were doorways. Maybe they were wounds in the fabric of existence. Maybe they were just really bad real estate. Whatever the case, simply avoiding these places was not sufficient, because the darkness within them had a way of spreading, of seeping out into the surrounding countryside like ink through water. Ignoring the problem only made it worse. The solution, according to medieval thinking, was to build directly on top of these cursed locations. Not next to them, not nearby, directly on top. The structure itself would act as a seal, a physical barrier reinforced by spiritual power. And this was not just any structure. It had to be specifically designed and oriented to maximize its containing properties. Churches were ideal because they brought the full weight of divine authority to bear against whatever lurked below. Chapels dedicated to warrior saints were even better because they added the dimension of active combat against evil. This is where the Archangel Michael enters our story, and his role in Czech sacred architecture deserves particular attention. Michael was not just any saint. He was the commander of heaven's armies, the one who had cast Satan out of paradise in the first place. In artistic depictions, he is almost always shown with a sword or spear, often in the act of driving that weapon through a serpent or dragon representing evil itself. He was, in other words, the ultimate bouncer for situations involving demonic incursion. If you had a hellmouth in your backyard, Michael was the entity you called. The tradition of building Michael churches on top of problematic locations goes back at least to the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine the Great reportedly converted a pagan temple into the Michaelion, one of the earliest and most famous sanctuaries dedicated to the Archangel. According to tradition, Constantine had been sleeping in what was then a pagan healing temple when he received a vision that the spirit of the place was actually Michael. Whether this was genuine divine communication, or an extremely practical way to repurpose existing infrastructure, the result was the same. A model for how to claim dangerous sacred sites for Christianity while keeping whatever power resided there safely contained. This pattern repeated across Europe with remarkable consistency. Caves that had been sites of pagan worship became churches to Michael. Mountaintops where pre-Christian peoples had lit fires to their gods became Michael shrines. And most intriguingly for our purposes, locations where the earth itself seemed wrong, where crevices exhaled strange vapors or the ground produced unexplained sounds, were capped with structures bearing Michael's name and image. The theory was elegant in its own way. The archangel who had defeated the devil could certainly handle whatever lesser evils might be lurking beneath any given chapel floor. The specifics of how these ceiling structures were designed revealed just how seriously medieval builders took their task. Orientation mattered enormously. Most churches faced east toward Jerusalem, but Michael churches on cursed sites often had additional geometric considerations, aligning with specific astronomical events or creating particular shapes when viewed from above. The foundations were not merely structural, but symbolic, often incorporating specific numbers of stones or particular arrangements meant to reinforce the seal. Some builders claimed to follow systems derived from ancient Jewish mysticism, incorporating Kabbalistic principles into Christian architecture. Others worked from traditions passed down through guilds, their specific methods kept as closely guarded secrets. Building materials could also carry significance. In some Czech locations, Moldavite fragments were reportedly incorporated into church foundations, the theory being that this cosmic glass could amplify or focus the sealing properties of the structure. Whether this actually happened, or is simply legend, is difficult to determine, since digging up medieval church foundations to check is generally frowned upon. But the prevalence of such stories suggests that the connection between the ancient meteorite impact and the effort to seal dark places was not lost on medieval minds. One of the most remarkable aspects of this architectural tradition is its durability. Even when the original justification was forgotten, when the knowledge of what lay beneath a particular chapel was lost to time, the structures remained. Communities continued to maintain them, to worship in them, to treat them as special without necessarily remembering why. It is as if some instinct recognized that these buildings served a purpose beyond the obvious, that removing them would be unwise even if no one could articulate exactly why. And throughout the Czech lands, this tradition created a landscape unlike any other in Europe. A network of ancient structures sitting on top of older power points, sitting on top of even older geological anomalies. The whole system stretching back through human history to that moment 15 million years ago when the sky fell and everything changed. Whether you view this as a coherent system of spiritual defense or an elaborate coincidence of mythology and architecture, the physical evidence remains. The churches still stand, the crevices they cover still exist, and the questions about what lies beneath remain unanswered. Some of these structures became famous pilgrimage sites. Others fell into obscurity, maintained by small rural communities who kept the old traditions alive without fully understanding them. A few were abandoned entirely, their purpose forgotten, their stones slowly being reclaimed by the forests. And at least one, a castle called Huska, about an hour north of Prague, would become the most famous sealed site in all of Central Europe. But that is a story that deserves its own chapter, because what allegedly lies beneath Huska's chapel floor is not merely strange. It is the stuff of genuine nightmares. Before we go there, though, it is worth pausing to appreciate the sheer audacity of the medieval approach to supernatural real estate problems. Imagine discovering that your property contains a potential gateway to some kind of hell dimension. The modern response would probably involve moving, immediately and at a dead run. The medieval response was to say, "Right then, let's build a church on it and solve this thing permanently." There is something almost admirable about that level of cosmic confidence, even if the wisdom of the strategy remains very much open to question. What made the Czech approach particularly distinctive was the layering of traditions. Celtic sacred sites became, Germanic holy places became Christian churches, each layer adding its own energy or protection, or simply its own interpretation of what the place meant. The Moldavites, scattered by an ancient cosmic impact, became talismans against evil. The natural radon emissions from certain geological formations became signs of supernatural presence. The complex geothermal activity beneath Czech soil became evidence of forces beyond normal understanding. Everything connected to everything else in a web of meaning that has been spinning for millennia and shows no sign of stopping. Today, places like the unfinished Gothic church at Panensky Tynek draw visitors who claim to feel unusual sensations in specific locations within the structure. Psychotronic researchers, which is a real field of study, though not one you will find at most accredited universities, have mapped what they call Zone Number 8 within its walls, supposedly a powerful positive energy field that relieves depression and promotes healing. Visitors report tingling in their extremities when standing in certain spots. The walls show wear patterns indicating that thousands of hands have touched the same locations over the years, seeking whatever power might reside there. Coincidence? The power of suggestion? Or something that medieval builders knew and modern science has not yet caught up with? The famous Baroque architect Jan Blaise Santini Eichel, who designed some of the Czech Republic's most striking religious buildings in the early 18th century, was known to incorporate mystical principles into his work. He studied Kabbalah, numerology, and what he called energy point theory. His buildings were not merely beautiful, but were designed as functional spiritual machines, each element serving both aesthetic and metaphysical purposes. Whether his methods actually worked as intended is unknowable, but his buildings have survived for 3 centuries and continue to inspire the kind of devotion that transcends ordinary architectural appreciation. All of which brings us to the fundamental question at the heart of Czech mysticism. Is any of this real? Did an ancient meteorite truly charge the land with unusual energies? Do medieval churches actually seal something beneath their foundations? Can anyone with sufficient sensitivity feel the power of places like Panensky Tynek, or the dozens of other energy points scattered across Bohemia and Moravia? The scientific answer is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and we have yet to find instruments capable of measuring mystical energy fields. The Moldavite impact is real, thoroughly documented geology. The churches exist. The traditions are well recorded, but the connections drawn between these elements remain in the realm of belief rather than proof. The pragmatic answer is that it does not matter. What matters is that for thousands of years, people have treated certain Czech locations as special. They have built on them, maintained them, visited them, and passed down stories about them from generation to generation. That continuity of human attention, whatever its ultimate justification, has created something real. A landscape of meaning that overlays the physical geography like a second map visible only to those who know how to read it. And the mysterious answer, the one that keeps researchers and curious visitors coming back year after year? That answer suggests we may not understand the world as well as we think we do. That there might be connections between cosmic events and earthly consequences that our current models cannot capture. That medieval builders, working from principles we have lost or never properly understood, might have known something we do not. Whatever your preferred answer, one thing is certain: the Czech Republic is not ordinary ground. It has not been ordinary since a kilometer-wide asteroid screamed out of the southwest 15 million years ago and changed everything. And the evidence of that extraordinariness, whether in the form of green cosmic glass or ancient stone churches, or modern visitors feeling mysterious tingles in specific locations, continues to accumulate. This is a land where the boundaries between the explained and unexplained have always been thin, where medieval builders thought it worthwhile to spend fortunes sealing places they believed connected to somewhere else entirely. And in the next chapter, we are going to visit the most famous of those sealed places, a castle built for no apparent human purpose, featuring a chapel over a bottomless pit where Nazi occultists conducted secret experiments during World War II, and where visitors still report encounters with things that should not exist. Welcome to Huska, the castle with a hellmouth for a basement. Picture yourself as a 13th century Czech peasant going about your daily business, which probably involves backbreaking labor, questionable hygiene, and a life expectancy that would make modern insurance companies weep with joy. Now imagine that about an hour's walk north of Prague, in a forested area that no one visits because there is literally no reason to visit it, there exists a hole in the ground. Not a cave, not a well, just a hole. A gaping wound in the limestone that swallows anything thrown into it, without ever producing the satisfying thunk of something hitting bottom. You toss in a stone, and you wait. And wait. And eventually you go home because your porridge is getting cold and you have a strong suspicion that stone is never coming back. This was the reality that locals faced for centuries before anyone decided to do something about it. The hole existed on a rocky cliff surrounded by dense forest, far from any trade route or settlement, in a location so inconvenient that even medieval real estate agents, had they existed, would have struggled to find a selling point. Great views of more forest. Walking distance from absolutely nothing. Features a mysterious bottomless void that occasionally vomits up nightmares. Not exactly the kind of listing that moves units. According to local tradition, this was not merely an unusual geological formation. This was the gateway to something far worse. Villagers reported that at night, things emerged from the darkness of that pit. Creatures that defied easy description. Half-human, half-animal hybrids that moved wrong, that smelled wrong, that looked at you with eyes that suggested they had seen things no earthly being should see. Dark-winged entities that did not so much fly as drift through the air with malevolent purpose. The reports were consistent enough and numerous enough that people simply stopped going anywhere near the area, which, given that there was no reason to go there anyway, was not exactly a major lifestyle adjustment. But here is where medieval problem-solving gets genuinely creative. The locals tried the obvious solution first. They attempted to fill the hole. They gathered stones. They organized work parties. They probably had potluck dinners to celebrate their upcoming victory over the forces of darkness. And they threw those stones into the pit. And threw more stones, and more. The hole, unsurprisingly to anyone who has ever tried to fill something called bottomless, remained unfilled. Every stone vanished into the void without making a dent. It was like trying to satisfy a teenager's appetite. Technically possible in theory, practically infinite in practice. This is when someone, probably after several rounds of whatever passed for alcohol in 13th century Bohemia, suggested the next logical step. If they could not fill the hole, perhaps they could seal it. And if they were going to seal it, they might as well do it properly, with a castle. Because when medieval people committed to a project, they really committed. The structure that would become Huska Castle began construction sometime between 1253 and 1278, during the reign of King Ottokar II of Bohemia. Now, Ottokar was a practical man who built castles for practical reasons. Defense, administration, impressing visiting dignitaries, the usual royal motivations. But Huska made no sense by any of these standards. It sat on no strategic position. It controlled no trade route. It had no water source beyond a cistern for collecting rainwater, which is the medieval equivalent of hoping it rains before you die of thirst. There was no kitchen. Many of the windows were fake, with thick walls blocking them from the inside. The defensive walls faced inward rather than outward, as if the structure was designed not to keep invaders out, but to keep something else in. Most tellingly, nobody lived there. This was a castle built for no apparent human purpose in a location that served no apparent human need. Unless, of course, the purpose was exactly what the legends suggested: to seal the gateway to hell and make absolutely certain that whatever lurked below could never escape. At the heart of the castle, directly above where the pit had been, the builders constructed a chapel. Not a large chapel, mind you, but one built with specific intention. The floor was laid with thick stone plates, layer upon layer, sealing whatever lay beneath with the combined weight of architecture and faith. The walls were decorated with frescoes that would be highly unusual in any normal place of worship. Instead of the typical biblical scenes, visitors found dragons, demonic creatures, and what appears to be pagan imagery. Most famously, there is a left-handed female centaur drawing a bow, and in medieval symbolism, left-handedness was associated with evil. It is as if the artists were documenting what the chapel was built to contain, rather than what worshippers were meant to contemplate. But before the chapel floor was sealed, before the castle walls rose to their full height, someone wanted answers. According to the most persistent legend, a duke of the powerful Duba clan decided that speculation was no longer sufficient. He wanted to know, with certainty, what lay at the bottom of the pit. And since sending yourself into a potentially demonic abyss is the kind of career move that tends to end careers, he came up with an alternative: condemned prisoners. The offer was straightforward in the way that only medieval justice could be. Any prisoner facing execution could earn a full pardon by completing one simple task. Allow yourself to be lowered into the pit on a rope and report back what you see. Freedom awaited those who returned with information. What could possibly go wrong? The first volunteer was reportedly a young man, healthy and vigorous, perhaps eager to escape whatever fate awaited him on the gallows. He was secured to a rope and lowered into the darkness. For the first few moments, nothing happened. The rope continued to unspool as the prisoner descended deeper and deeper into the earth. Silence from below. The watchers above probably exchanged nervous glances, wondering how deep this thing actually went. wondering if they had brought enough rope. Then came the screaming. Not the scream of physical pain, though that might have been more comprehensible. This was the scream of absolute terror, the sound of a human mind encountering something it was never designed to process. The prisoner shrieked to be pulled up, his voice echoing from the depths with a quality that suggested he was not merely frightened, but fundamentally broken by what he had witnessed. When they hauled him back to the surface, the young man who had descended was gone. In his place was something that looked like him but had aged decades in minutes. His hair, which had been dark when he went down, was now completely white. His face was lined with wrinkles that had not existed moments before. His eyes held the vacant stare of someone who had seen too much and could never unsee it. According to some accounts, he babbled incoherently about winged creatures in the darkness, about hybrid monsters that were part human and part beast, about things moving in the void that had no right to exist. According to other accounts, he said nothing at all, having lost the capacity for speech along with his sanity. He died within 2 days, some say. Others claim he was committed to what passed for an asylum in those times, where he spent his remaining life staring at walls and occasionally screaming without warning. The pardon he had been promised was technically still valid, not that it did him much good. Did this stop others from trying? Of course not. Medieval people were remarkably persistent, especially when freedom was on the line. According to some versions of the legend, multiple prisoners took the same gamble and suffered the same fate. Each one went down young and healthy. Each one came back aged and insane. Each one provided the same fragmentary descriptions of horrors lurking in the depths before succumbing to whatever had broken their minds. Eventually, presumably, the supply of prisoners willing to risk it dried up, or perhaps the authorities decided they had gathered enough data to confirm their worst suspicions. The chapel was built, the hole was sealed, and Huska Castle took its place as the medieval equivalent of a warning sign. Do not enter. And this time, we really mean it. But sealing something and destroying it are two very different things. And whatever resided beneath Huska's chapel floor did not disappear simply because humans decided to cover it with stone. If the legends are to be believed, and a remarkable number of people across centuries have believed them, the darkness below never stopped trying to make itself known. We need to talk about the sounds. Huska Castle, despite its remote location and general air of malevolent history, has been continuously maintained over the centuries. It changed hands numerous times, was renovated in the Renaissance style, fell into ruins, was restored, and eventually found its way to the Simonek family, descendants of the former president of Skoda Automobiles, who own it to this day. Through all these transitions, through all the different caretakers and visitors and occasional tourists who have passed through its halls, one thing has remained constant. People keep hearing things they cannot explain. The reports start with workers. During one of the castle's many renovation periods in the 19th century, a laborer was conducting repairs near the chapel when he heard something that made him drop his tools and flee the building. Voices. Not the voices of his fellow workers, who were in other parts of the structure, but voices emanating from within the walls themselves. They spoke in a language he did not recognize, words that seemed to writhe in the air rather than simply being spoken. But one word, one single word, stuck in his memory with such force that he reported it despite his terror. Seraph. For those unfamiliar with biblical terminology, seraphim are celestial beings mentioned in the Old Testament, specifically in the book of Isaiah. They are described as having 6 wings and standing in the presence of God, crying, "Holy, holy, holy," in eternal praise. In Christian angelology, they are typically considered the highest order of angels, the ones closest to the divine. The word itself comes from a Hebrew root meaning to burn, and seraphim are often associated with fire, purification, and overwhelming spiritual power. So why would the name of the highest-ranking angels be echoing from the walls of a castle built to seal a gateway to hell? The theological implications are either deeply reassuring or deeply disturbing, depending on your perspective. Perhaps divine forces were present to help contain whatever lurked below. Or perhaps whatever lurked below was mocking the very concept of heaven by invoking its inhabitants. Or perhaps, and this is the interpretation that tends to keep people awake at night, the entities beneath Huska were not demons at all, but something else entirely. Something that predated the convenient categories of heaven and hell that medieval Christianity used to organize the supernatural. The worker who heard the voices never returned to Huska. His name has been lost to history, but his report spawned a tradition of similar accounts that continues to the present day. Visitors to the castle describe hearing screams that seem to rise from the chapel floor, as if something beneath the stone plates is still trying to claw its way out. Others report scratching sounds, like fingernails on rock, persistent and rhythmic, and deeply unnerving. The sounds are most commonly reported at night, though they have been heard during daylight hours as well, particularly in the quieter parts of the castle, where modern ambient noise has not yet intruded. Paranormal investigators have been visiting Hoska since the concept of paranormal investigation became a thing people did for entertainment rather than religious necessity. The castle has been featured on Ghost Hunters International, Most Haunted Live, and numerous other television programs dedicated to seeking evidence of the supernatural. These investigations have produced their own catalog of peculiar experiences. Electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP, recordings from Hoska have captured sounds that investigators cannot explain through normal means. Equipment malfunctions are remarkably common, with cameras failing, audio recorders producing static at crucial moments, and battery-powered devices draining inexplicably fast. Electromagnetic field detectors, the bread and butter of modern ghost hunting, produce readings near the chapel that are difficult to account for given the castle's construction and location. One investigation team from the Czech Republic conducted an overnight research session in 2014. Their report, posted to paranormal research databases, describes a night that started frustratingly quiet and became progressively more unsettling. Initially, the investigators found nothing unusual beyond the expected creaks and groans of an old building settling in the cold. The wind outside created eerie sounds through less insulated portions of the structure, but these were identifiable and dismissible. Then, as midnight approached, things changed. Members of the team reported hearing a woman's voice in areas where no woman was present. The voice was fleeting, heard by some investigators and not others, disappearing before it could be recorded. Later, in a different part of the castle, a melody was captured on audio equipment, though all cell phones were supposed to be in airplane mode. In the chapel itself, where the team had positioned recording equipment, their devices captured two loud bangs that occurred when no one was in the room. The sounds were described as resembling something heavy striking the floor from beneath, like a hammer blow delivered from the wrong side of the stone. Several team members also reported physical sensations. One investigator developed what appeared to be burns on his skin, red marks that appeared without any contact with hot surfaces or flames. Another noticed scratches on his hand that he had not been aware of receiving, only discovering them when he returned home and examined himself in better lighting. A later review attributed at least some of these physical effects to allergic reactions to plant pollen present in the castle, but the investigators themselves were not entirely convinced by this explanation. The pattern of equipment failure at Hoska deserves particular attention because it is so consistent across different investigation teams using different equipment over different time periods. Cameras that worked perfectly before entering the castle suddenly produce corrupted files. Audio recorders capture hours of static interspersed with brief moments of clarity that seem to coincide with the most interesting phenomena. Batteries drain at rates that exceed their normal discharge curves, sometimes dying completely within hours of being fully charged. Skeptics attribute this to the castle's stone construction interfering with electronics, or to the cold temperatures affecting battery chemistry. But these explanations do not fully account for why the problems seem concentrated in specific areas and at specific times. The cold spots are another recurring theme. Visitors and investigators alike report sudden, dramatic drops in temperature in certain parts of the castle, particularly near the chapel and in the corridors leading to it. These cold spots move, shifting location from visit to visit, as if whatever causes them is patrolling its territory. People who walk through these areas describe feeling not just physical cold, but a deeper chill, an emotional response that goes beyond mere temperature change. The sensation is often described as being watched, being evaluated, being found wanting by something that exists just beyond the edge of perception. And then there are the visual phenomena. The most frequently reported apparition at Hoska is a figure dressed entirely in black, wearing a cloak and hood that obscure all features. This figure is said to appear on the battlements, in the courtyard, and occasionally within the castle itself, always at a distance, always watching. When approached, it vanishes. Some witnesses describe it as a guardian, keeping watch over the sealed pit. Others interpret it as something that escaped before the seal was complete and now haunts the structure that was meant to contain it. Other reported sightings include a headless black horse that gallops through the courtyard, particularly terrifying because headless horses should not be able to gallop anywhere. A spectral monk who appears in the chapel, an old woman who materializes in the upper floors, and various hybrid creatures that match the descriptions given by those unfortunate prisoners centuries ago. Whether any of these sightings represent genuine supernatural phenomena, or merely the overactive imaginations of visitors primed by centuries of legends, is, of course, impossible to determine with certainty. What can be determined is that the stories have not stopped. Despite the passage of 700 years, despite the chapel and its thick stone floor, despite the rationalization efforts of modern skepticism, people continue to hear things at Huska Castle that they cannot explain. The sounds from below have not ceased. The voice that spoke the word seraph was not the last to emerge from those ancient walls. And the question of what exactly was sealed beneath that Gothic chapel remains as open today as it was when the first prisoner came back from the depths with white hair and a broken mind. The castle is open to the public now, managed by the Simonek family, and available for guided tours during daylight hours. Visitors come from around the world, drawn by the legends and curious to experience the atmosphere for themselves. Many report nothing unusual, enjoying a pleasant tour of a well-preserved medieval structure with interesting architectural features and a fascinating history. Others leave with stories of their own. Unexplained sounds, sudden chills, the unmistakable sensation of being observed by something unseen. The pit itself remains sealed, has been sealed for over 7 centuries, and by all appearances will remain sealed for the foreseeable future. The current owners do not permit excavation of any kind within the castle, citing the landmines that had to be cleared from the property after World War II, but perhaps also recognizing that some questions are better left unanswered. After all, whatever curiosity drove that first prisoner to accept the Duke's bargain did not serve him well. The knowledge he gained cost him everything. And yet the sounds continue. In the quiet hours, when the tourists have gone and the castle settles into its nightly routine, something beneath the chapel floor is still trying to make itself heard. Whether it is calling out, calling for help, calling a warning, or simply calling to whatever might listen, no one knows. The language remains unknown. The word seraph echoes through the centuries. And Huska Castle stands as it has always stood, a seal over something that humanity decided long ago should never be released. If you thought a castle built over a supposed gateway to hell was strange enough, wait until you hear what happened when the 20th century's most infamous regime decided to move in. Because in 1939, when Nazi Germany swallowed Czechoslovakia whole, someone in the Wehrmacht or the SS looked at a map, saw Huska Castle sitting in the middle of absolutely nowhere and thought, yes, that one. We need that one specifically. And honestly, that decision tells you everything you need to know about how deeply weird the Nazi relationship with the occult actually was. Let us be clear about something first. The Nazi occupation of Huska Castle makes no military sense whatsoever. Zero. None. This is a castle without fortifications, without a water supply, without even a proper kitchen for most of its history. It sits on a cliff surrounded by dense forest, far from any strategic target, controlling no roads, guarding no borders, threatening no enemies. If you were running a conventional military operation, Huska would not make your list of top 100,000 priorities. It probably would not make your list at all. You would look at it, shrug, and move on to occupying something useful, like a bridge or a factory or literally anything with running water. And yet the SS moved in. They occupied Huska from 1939 to 1945, the entire duration of the war in Czechoslovakia. They stationed troops there. They brought equipment. They conducted activities that remain almost entirely unknown to this day, because, in typical SS fashion, they destroyed all records and evidence of their work before retreating in the face of advancing Russian and American forces. Whatever happened at Huska during those 6 years vanished into the same black hole of deliberate erasure that swallowed so many Nazi secrets. But here's the thing about secrets. They have a way of leaking out. And the locals who lived in the surrounding villages during the occupation remember things. They remember strange lights emanating from the castle at night. They remember sounds that carried across the forest, sounds that did not belong to normal military operations. They remember trucks arriving and leaving at odd hours, carrying cargo that was always covered and never explained. And they remember that the SS seemed very, very interested in what lay beneath the castle's chapel floor. To understand why the Nazis might have cared about a supposed gateway to hell, you need to understand something about the leadership of the Third Reich that often gets overlooked in favor of their more conventionally terrifying activities. The upper echelons of the Nazi Party, particularly Heinrich Himmler's SS, were absolutely obsessed with the occult. This was not a fringe interest or a casual hobby. This was a systematic, well-funded attempt to harness supernatural power for the German war effort. Himmler himself founded the Ahnenerbe Institute in 1935, an organization dedicated to researching the archaeological and cultural history of the supposed Aryan race. But the Ahnenerbe's interests went far beyond conventional archaeology. They searched for magical artifacts. They studied ancient texts for hidden knowledge. They dispatched expeditions to Tibet seeking mystical wisdom. They investigated ley lines and energy points and anything else that might give the Reich an edge that conventional science could not provide. The Indiana Jones movies, for all their Hollywood embellishment, were based on a genuine Nazi obsession with finding supernatural weapons. Himmler reportedly amassed a personal library of over 13,000 manuscripts related to the occult, witchcraft, and forbidden knowledge. As the war turned against Germany and Allied bombing threatened Berlin, these precious documents needed to be secured somewhere safe. According to some accounts, Hauska Castle became one of those hiding places. A remote location, easily defended, far from any bombing targets, and sitting on top of what local legend claimed was a direct connection to forces beyond normal human understanding. For an occultist like Himmler, it must have seemed like the perfect combination. But storing books, however blasphemous, does not require a 6-year occupation by SS troops. What else were they doing? The theories range from the plausible to the genuinely disturbing. One persistent claim is that Hauska served as a Lebensborn facility, one of the SS's secret breeding programs designed to create the so-called master race. These programs, which definitely existed elsewhere, involved pairing young women of acceptable Aryan bloodlines with SS officers to produce children who would be raised as perfect Nazi specimens. The remote location of Hauska would have made it ideal for such a program. Isolated enough to maintain secrecy, yet accessible enough for participants to come and go. If this theory is true, it would explain some of the sounds the locals reported, the coming and going of vehicles at night, the general air of secretive activity. It would not, however, explain the strange lights or the SS's apparent interest in the chapel and what lay beneath it. For that, we need the darker theories. Some researchers believe that the Nazis were attempting to open the gateway, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally trying to break the seal that medieval builders had placed over the pit and access whatever power resided below. Given what we know about Himmler's beliefs and the resources he directed toward supernatural research, this is not as absurd as it sounds. The man genuinely believed that occult forces could be weaponized. If he knew about Hauska's reputation, and he almost certainly did given how extensively the Ahnenerbe researched such sites, he would have been very interested indeed. The locals reported hearing screams and cries in multiple languages coming from the castle at night. Some of these might have been the sounds of childbirth if the Lebensborn theory is correct. But others were described differently, as sounds of pain and terror that suggested something far worse than maternity care was occurring behind those stone walls. Were the Nazis conducting experiments? On whom? And to what end? When the war ended and the castle was cleared, workers found something unexpected in the inner courtyard. The skeletons of 3 German soldiers, buried on the grounds without any military honors or documentation. These were not combat casualties. There had been no fighting at Hauska, no battles, no sieges, no Allied attacks on this strategically worthless position. So why were 3 Nazi soldiers buried there, apparently executed, with no record of their crimes or their punishment? The theories multiply. Perhaps they saw something they should not have seen. Perhaps they refused to participate in something unconscionable. Perhaps they simply knew too much about what was happening in the castle and had to be silenced before the retreat. We will never know for certain, because whatever records might have explained their fate were destroyed along with everything else. The current owners of Hauska Castle, descendants of the Simonek family who purchased it in 1924 before losing it during the occupation, have consistently refused to allow any excavation of the grounds. They cite the presence of Nazi landmines, which had to be cleared from the property after the war, as one reason for this prohibition. But some observers suspect another motivation: a reluctance to discover what else might be buried there, or what the archaeological investigation of the chapel floor might reveal about the pit that lies beneath. The Nazis' interest in Hauska adds another layer to the castle's already considerable mystique. It suggests that whatever reputation the site had accumulated over centuries was compelling enough to draw the attention of a regime that actively sought supernatural weapons. Whether they found anything useful is unknown. Whether they accidentally made things worse is equally unknown. But the fact that they tried, that they devoted resources and personnel to investigating a medieval castle's legendary connection to hell while fighting a war on multiple fronts, says something profound about how seriously some of history's most dangerous people took these legends. And that brings us to perhaps the strangest chapter in Huska's long, strange history. The evidence, such as it is, that time itself does not behave normally in this place. We need to talk about Karel Hynek Mácha, and we need to take this story seriously, despite how insane it sounds, because the documentation is surprisingly robust, even if the interpretation remains wildly controversial. Mácha was born in 1810 and became one of the most celebrated poets in Czech literature. His masterwork, May, is considered a foundational text of Czech Romanticism, and he remains a beloved figure in Czech culture nearly 2 centuries after his death. He was also, by all accounts, a rational man, with no particular interest in the supernatural. He was a poet, not a mystic. He wrote about love and nature and the human condition, not about demons or time travel or gateways to hell. In 1836, the year of his death at the tragically young age of 25, Mácha undertook a walking tour of the Bohemian countryside. During this journey, he spent a night at Huska Castle. What happened that night, he recorded in a letter to his friend Edward, a letter that has been preserved and can be examined to this day, though some researchers have questioned its authenticity. According to this letter, Mácha had a dream, or a vision, or an experience that he struggled to categorize using the vocabulary available to a 19th century poet. He described his soul descending into the pit beneath the castle's chapel and being transported somewhere else entirely. Not to hell, as the legends might have predicted, but to Prague. Prague in the year 2006. Let that sink in for a moment. A man in 1836 claimed to have been transported, in some form, to a specific year in the future. Not the vague future. Not someday. The year 2006, precisely 170 years ahead of when he was writing. In this vision, Mácha wandered through a nightmarish, mechanized landscape that he found horrifying and incomprehensible. He described high sandstone cliffs riddled with holes that projected an eerie yellow light. To modern observers, this description is uncannily similar to the Sid list, the massive communist-era housing blocks that now loom over the outskirts of Prague. These brutalist apartment towers, with their thousands of identical windows glowing at night, would indeed look like cliffs with illuminated holes to someone who had never seen anything taller than a church steeple. Mácha also described meeting a girl who showed him moving pictures in a small casket. The current Castellan of Huska, who has studied the letter extensively, interprets this as a description of a mobile phone or similar device. A small rectangular object that displays moving images would have been utterly incomprehensible to someone from 1836, and a casket with moving pictures is about as good a description as you could expect from someone trying to describe technology that would not exist for another century and a half. He wrote about monsters with glowing eyes that herded crowds of people dressed as clowns toward the castle. The Castellan suggests these monsters were automobiles, their headlights the glowing eyes, and the clown costumes were modern, casual clothing, tracksuit-style garments that would have seemed bizarrely colorful and informal to someone accustomed to 19th century dress. Now, before we go any further, let us acknowledge the obvious objections. The letter might be a forgery. It might be a later addition to Mácha's correspondence, fabricated by someone who wanted to create a mysterious backstory for Huska Castle. Even if authentic, it might simply describe a vivid dream influenced by local legends about the castle's supernatural properties. Dreams can be extraordinarily detailed and strange without requiring any paranormal explanation. But consider what Mácha would have needed to imagine in order to produce this description purely from his subconscious in 1836. He would have needed to envision massive residential buildings that did not exist anywhere in the world. He would have needed to imagine portable devices that could display moving images, a technology that was not only non-existent, but essentially inconceivable given the state of photography and cinematography at the time. He would have needed to predict the aesthetic of automobiles, clothing styles, and urban planning that would not emerge for decades or centuries. Either Mácha had the most prophetically accurate imagination in human history, or something happened to him at Huska Castle that defies easy explanation. And he is not the only one to report temporal anomalies at the site. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, visitors to Huska have described experiences that suggest time does not flow normally within its walls. Some report watches stopping or running at incorrect speeds. Others describe periods of missing time, entering a room and emerging to find that hours have passed when they perceived only minutes. Electronic devices malfunction with remarkable frequency, and not just in the ways that might be explained by the castle's stone construction or lack of modern wiring. Batteries drain completely in minutes. Recording equipment produces corrupted files that seem to show impossible things. Car batteries in the parking lot have been known to die simultaneously, requiring a priest to bless them with holy water before they would function again, according to one particularly colorful local account. Paranormal investigators who have studied Huska report capturing sounds and images that appear to show figures in clothing from different historical periods, sometimes within the same frame. The castle seems to exist in multiple times at once, with the boundaries between past, present, and future becoming permeable within its walls. Is any of this real? Can it be verified in ways that would satisfy scientific skepticism? The honest answer is no. These are anecdotes, legends, subjective experiences that resist objective measurement. The Matcha letter, even if authentic, proves only that a poet in 1836 had an extraordinarily vivid dream. The battery failures and equipment malfunctions might have mundane explanations. The missing time could be the result of disorientation in an unfamiliar environment. And yet the pattern persists. Across centuries, across different observers with different backgrounds and different expectations, the same themes emerge. Something at Huska does not respect the normal rules. The pit that medieval builders sealed with a chapel may not connect to hell in any theological sense, but it does seem to connect to somewhere, or somewhen, that lies outside ordinary experience. The poet who glimpsed 2006 in 1836, the prisoners who aged decades in minutes, the Nazis who sought to harness forces beyond normal science, the tourists who lose time and find their phones filled with unexplainable images. All of them encountered something at Huska that challenged their understanding of how reality is supposed to work. Perhaps the medieval builders were right to seal it. Perhaps some doors, once opened, lead to places that human minds were not designed to comprehend. And perhaps the castle that sits over that sealed door serves its original purpose still, not as a home, not as a fortress, not as an administrative center, but as a warning. A massive stone reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some depths are not meant to be plumbed, and some places exist to keep humanity safe from what lies beneath. The pit remains sealed, the chapel floor remains intact, and Huska Castle stands as it has stood for nearly 8 centuries, keeping whatever lurks below away from the world above. For now, at least. Because if there is one thing that history teaches us, it is that humanity's curiosity eventually overcomes its fear. Sooner or later, someone always tries to open the door. When that day comes for Huska, we can only hope that whoever does the opening is prepared for what they find. The prisoners of the 13th century were not. The poet of the 19th century was not. The Nazis of the 20th century destroyed all evidence of what they encountered, which is perhaps the most telling detail of all. Whatever they found at Huska, it was something they did not want the world to know about. And on that thoroughly unsettling note, we leave the castle behind and travel southwest toward the ancient city of Prague, where an entirely different kind of mystery awaits. Because if Huska represents the dark side of Czech mysticism, Prague represents its scholarly and creative side. A city where alchemists sought the philosopher's stone, where astronomers charted the heavens while their colleagues cast horoscopes, and where a rabbi may or may not have created artificial life from river clay. Welcome to alchemical Prague, where magic and science once shared the same laboratory. After the horrors of Huska Castle and its gateway to somewhere better left unnamed, it is time to visit a very different kind of Czech mysticism. Welcome to Prague, a city that in the late 16th century became the undisputed capital of European weirdness. And I mean that as a compliment. Because while other Renaissance courts were busy with boring things like wars and politics, Prague was hosting the greatest gathering of alchemists, astrologers, mystics, and genuinely strange individuals that Europe had ever seen. And the man responsible for this cosmic cocktail party was one of history's most eccentric rulers, Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire. Rudolf was not your typical Habsburg monarch. Most Habsburgs were intensely practical people who focused on maintaining their vast territorial holdings, arranging advantageous marriages, and occasionally waging war against whoever happened to be annoying them that decade. Rudolf, by contrast, had approximately zero interest in any of this. He found politics tedious, warfare distasteful, and his relatives irritating. What he actually wanted to do was collect strange objects, sponsor bizarre experiments, and discover the fundamental secrets of the universe. In modern terms, he was the Renaissance equivalent of a billionaire who decides to fund a Mars colony and an immortality research lab simultaneously. Except instead of rockets and gene therapy, Rudolf was interested in philosopher's stones and elixirs of life. In 1583, Rudolf moved his court from Vienna to Prague, which at the time was a larger and more cosmopolitan city. This was not a temporary visit. Rudolf intended to make Prague the center of his empire, and more importantly, the center of his intellectual pursuits. Over the following decades, he transformed Prague Castle into something that had never existed before, a research institution dedicated to exploring the boundaries between the known and the unknown, staffed by some of the greatest minds of the age, and also some of the greatest charlatans. Distinguishing between the two was not always easy, which was kind of the point. In an era when nobody really understood where chemistry ended and magic began, you hired everyone who seemed promising and hoped for the best. The result was what historians now call the Rudolphine Renaissance, a period when Prague became a magnet for scholars, artists, and seekers of forbidden knowledge from across Europe. If you were an astronomer tired of being called a heretic for suggesting the Earth moved, you came to Prague. If you were an alchemist whose experiments had gotten you run out of every other court in Christendom, you came to Prague. If you were a mathematician who also happened to believe you could talk to angels, well, Prague was definitely the place for you. Rudolf did not merely tolerate unusual thinkers. He actively sought them out, funded their work, and protected them from the religious authorities who would have burned half of them for heresy if given the chance. The most famous location associated with Prague's alchemical golden age is the Golden Lane, a narrow street of tiny houses built into the northern fortification walls of Prague Castle. According to Romantic legend, this is where Rudolf's alchemists lived and worked, conducting secret experiments in their cramped laboratories while trying to transmute base metals into gold. It is a wonderful story, and tourists adore it. And it is almost entirely not true. The actual residents of Golden Lane were castle guards who received permission to build the houses in 1597, followed by goldsmiths and other craftsmen in later centuries. The name probably comes either from these goldsmiths or, less romantically, from the color of the street when it was soiled with human waste, since 16 houses shared only 2 primitive toilets. Not exactly the mystical atmosphere the tourist brochures suggest. The real alchemical laboratories were elsewhere in the castle complex, particularly in the Mihulka Tower and along Vikarska Street, where Rudolf had proper facilities constructed for serious experimental work. Here, surrounded by alembics and retorts and all the elaborate glassware of Renaissance chemistry, the emperor's sponsored researchers pursued what they considered the greatest scientific prize imaginable, the philosopher's stone. Now, before you dismiss this as pure medieval nonsense, understand that alchemy in the 16th century was not considered pseudoscience. It was considered science, period. The theoretical framework was different from what we use today, but the methodology was often rigorous. Alchemists conducted careful experiments, recorded their results, and attempted to replicate each other's work. The problem was that they were working from flawed premises about the fundamental nature of matter, which meant that no amount of careful experimentation could produce the results they sought. But they did not know that. They genuinely believed that with enough skill, knowledge, and perhaps a little divine favor, they could transform lead into gold, create an elixir that cured all diseases, and unlock the secrets of immortality itself. Rudolf's obsession with the philosopher's stone was not merely theoretical. He genuinely believed it existed, and that someone at his court would eventually discover it. This belief cost him enormous sums of money, since every alchemist who arrived in Prague needed funding for equipment, materials, and living expenses, and many of them turned out to be either incompetent or outright fraudulent. But Rudolf kept paying, because the potential reward, if any of them succeeded, was literally infinite. Eternal life and unlimited gold would make any previous expense seem trivial. Among the most notorious figures to arrive at Rudolf's court were the English duo of John Dee and Edward Kelly. Dee was one of the foremost scholars of his age, a mathematician, astronomer, and consultant to Queen Elizabeth I of England on matters both scientific and occult. He was also convinced that he had developed a method for communicating with angels through a system of mirrors and crystals operated by a specially gifted medium. That medium was Edward Kelly, a man of considerably more questionable credentials, who claimed he could not only speak with celestial beings, but also transmute metals into gold. The two arrived in Prague in the 1580s and quickly caught Rudolf's attention. Kelly, in particular, seemed to produce results. He reportedly demonstrated successful transmutations in front of witnesses, turning base metals into gold using a mysterious red powder that he claimed to have discovered in an English abbey. Whether these demonstrations involved actual alchemy or simply very clever sleight of hand remains debated to this day. What is certain is that Rudolf was initially impressed enough to shower both men with patronage. The relationship soured spectacularly. Dee eventually left Prague after quarreling with Kelly, returning to England where he would spend his final years in poverty and obscurity. Kelly stayed and continued to promise results that never quite materialized. Rudolf's patience, legendary among alchemists for its length, finally ran out. He had Kelly arrested, officially for illegal dueling, but actually because he was convinced Kelly knew the secret of transmutation and was holding out on him. Kelly was imprisoned in the White Tower of Prague Castle, which visitors can still see today, and interrogated in an effort to extract the formula Rudolf believed he possessed. It did not go well for Kelly. He attempted to escape by jumping from a window, broke his leg so badly it had to be amputated, and eventually died from what may have been poison, either administered by others or taken by his own hand. The secret of the philosopher's stone, if he ever possessed it, died with him. Rudolf was left with nothing but a diminished treasury and a reinforced lesson about the difference between promising results and delivering them. Not that this stopped him from funding other alchemists afterward. The dream was too powerful to abandon. But Prague's significance in the history of science does not rest on the failures of its alchemists. It rests on the successes of its astronomers, and particularly on the extraordinary collaboration between two men who, between them, revolutionized our understanding of how planets move: Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. Tycho Brahe was, by any measure, one of the strangest people ever to make fundamental contributions to science. Born to Danish nobility in 1546, he lost part of his nose in a duel during his student years and wore a metal prosthetic for the rest of his life, reportedly made of gold and silver alloy, though examination of his remains suggests it may have been brass. He made precise astronomical observations for decades, building the most accurate star catalogues the world had ever seen, all without the benefit of a telescope, which had not yet been invented. He also kept a pet moose that reportedly died after getting drunk at a party and falling downstairs, which tells you something about the kind of parties Tycho threw. After falling out with the Danish king, Tycho relocated to Prague in 1599, accepting a position as Rudolf's imperial astronomer. The emperor was delighted. Finally, he had one of Europe's greatest scientists working directly for him. Tycho established an observatory, first at Benátky Castle north of Prague, and then on the terrace of the Queen Anne's summer palace within the castle complex itself, and continued his meticulous observations. But Tycho knew he needed something he himself lacked: mathematical genius capable of analyzing his mountains of data and extracting their meaning. Enter Johannes Kepler, a German mathematician with terrible eyesight, humble origins, and one of the most brilliant minds in the history of science. Kepler arrived in Prague in 1600, initially as Tycho's assistant. The relationship was contentious from the start. Tycho guarded his observational data jealously, releasing it to Kepler only in small pieces, suspicious that the younger man might use it to prove theories Tycho disagreed with. Kepler, for his part, was convinced that Tycho's geocentric model of the solar system was wrong, and that the data would prove it. They argued constantly, reconciled, argued again, and somehow managed to produce remarkable work together despite their mutual frustrations. Then, in October 1601, Tycho died suddenly at the age of 54. The cause was long attributed to a burst bladder brought on by excessive politeness. Supposedly, he refused to excuse himself from a banquet to urinate because it would have been rude, and the resulting rupture killed him. Modern examinations of his remains suggest mercury poisoning may have been involved, though whether from murder, self-medication, or accidental exposure during alchemical experiments remains unclear. Some have even suggested Kepler himself might have poisoned his mentor to gain access to the precious data. The 2010 exhumation of Tycho's body found no evidence of lethal mercury levels, but the mystery persists. Whatever the cause of death, Rudolf immediately appointed Kepler as imperial mathematician, giving him both Tycho's position and, finally, full access to his observations. What Kepler did with that data over the next decade changed science forever. Working in Prague, he discovered that planets do not move in perfect circles, as had been assumed since ancient times, but in ellipses with the sun at one focus. He determined that planets move faster when closer to the sun and slower when farther away, sweeping out equal areas in equal times. These discoveries, published in his Astronomia Nova in 1609, became the first two of what we now call Kepler's laws of planetary motion. The third would follow in 1618. The importance of this cannot be overstated. Kepler's laws provided the mathematical foundation that Isaac Newton would later use to develop his theory of universal gravitation. Without Tycho's observations and Kepler's analysis, conducted in Prague under Rudolf's patronage, modern physics as we know it might have developed decades or centuries later. The Renaissance city that welcomed alchemists seeking the philosopher's stone also hosted the birth of modern orbital mechanics. The boundaries between magic and science were not just blurry in Rudolf's Prague, they were actively being redrawn. What makes this period so fascinating is precisely this coexistence of what we would now consider legitimate science with what we would consider occultism. Rudolf employed both Kepler and various alchemists simultaneously. Tycho himself practiced alchemy alongside his astronomical observations. Kepler, for all his mathematical brilliance, cast horoscopes as part of his official duties, including a notably accurate one for the military commander Albrecht Waldstein that predicted his antisocial tendencies and morbid ambition. The emperor demanded horoscopes constantly, believing implicitly in astrology, even while funding research that would eventually undermine its theoretical basis. This was not cognitive dissonance. It was simply how educated people understood the universe in the early 17th century. The cosmos was alive with correspondences and influences. The stars affected earthly events. Matter could be transformed through the right procedures. The goal of natural philosophy was to understand these hidden connections and harness them for human benefit. Astronomy and astrology were two sides of the same coin. Chemistry and alchemy were the same discipline viewed from different angles. Only in hindsight do we draw sharp lines between the rational and the mystical, and only because later centuries decided that certain approaches worked and others did not. Rudolf himself did not live to see the full triumph of the scientific method. He descended into depression and paranoia in his later years, increasingly isolated as his political power crumbled. His brother Matthias stripped him of most of his authority in 1611, and Rudolf died the following year, probably of syphilis, definitely alone and bitter. The vast collections he had assembled, the Kunstkammer full of curiosities and wonders, were eventually dispersed across Europe. Prague's position as the capital of intellectual strangeness faded as the court returned to Vienna. But the legacy remained. The tolerance that allowed Tycho and Kepler to work in peace also allowed Prague's Jewish community to flourish under the leadership of Rabbi Loew, creating one of the most vibrant centers of Jewish learning in Europe. It allowed artists like Giuseppe Arcimboldo to create their bizarre composite portraits. It allowed thinkers from across the religious and intellectual spectrum to gather, argue, and occasionally discover truths that would reshape human understanding. And it left Prague with a reputation for mysticism that endures to this day. The golden spires, the Gothic towers, the narrow alchemical laboratories where scholars once sought to unlock the secrets of transformation. These form the backdrop to a city that seems perpetually caught between the rational and the mysterious. Walk through Old Town on a foggy evening, and it is easy to imagine Rudolf's alchemists hurrying to their next experiment. Kepler calculating orbital trajectories by candlelight. Tycho adjusting his brass nose before attending a royal audience. The past is very close here, and its boundaries, like the boundaries between science and magic that Rudolf's scholars struggled to define, seem thinner than they ought to be. Speaking of Rabbi Loew, that flourishing Jewish community he led produced perhaps the most famous legend in all of Prague's mystical history. A story about a man who created life from clay, who built a guardian to protect his people, and who discovered that the line between creation and catastrophe is terrifyingly thin. That story is next, the legend of the golem. From alchemists seeking to transform lead into gold, we now turn to the most ambitious transformation of all, turning lifeless clay into a living being. This is the story of the golem, Prague's most famous supernatural resident, a creature that has haunted the city's imagination for centuries and, remarkably, continues to haunt our conversations about technology today. Because long before anyone worried about artificial intelligence going rogue, long before science fiction writers imagined robot uprisings, there was a rabbi, a lump of river mud, and a question that still has no satisfying answer. What happens when humans create something that develops a will of its own? The legend takes place in Prague's Jewish quarter, which in the 16th century was one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe. Today this area is called Josefov, a gentrified neighborhood of elegant boulevards and expensive shops. But back then it was a cramped ghetto where Jews were legally required to live, separated from the rest of the city by walls and gates. Life in the ghetto was precarious at the best of times. At the worst of times, it was deadly. The Jewish community faced periodic waves of violence, often sparked by accusations of blood libel, the grotesque medieval lie that Jews murdered Christian children and used their blood for religious rituals. After particularly inflammatory sermons, mobs would pour out of churches and into the ghetto, and there was precious little the residents could do to defend themselves. Into this context stepped Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel, known as the Maharal of Prague, one of the most brilliant Jewish scholars of his era. The historical Maharal was a philosopher, a writer, and a religious leader whose works are still studied today. He was a rigorous Talmudic scholar who wrote some 27 books on Jewish thought and ethics. He was not, despite what the legends say, known during his lifetime as a mystic or a magician. That reputation came later, attached to him posthumously like a colorful but historically questionable accessory. The real Rabbi Loew was probably too busy writing serious philosophical treatises to spend his evenings molding supernatural creatures out of river mud. But legends have a way of choosing their heroes, and the Maharal was simply too perfect a figure to leave unadorned by myth. He lived in Prague during the reign of Rudolf II, the emperor we met in the previous chapter, who filled his court with alchemists and mystics. According to some accounts, Rudolf actually summoned Rabbi Loew for a private audience, reportedly to discuss matters of Kabbalah and mysticism. Whether they actually met or what they discussed remains historically uncertain. But the detail feeds into the larger narrative. Here was a rabbi who moved in circles where the boundaries between the possible and the impossible were actively being negotiated. The legend goes something like this. Faced with yet another wave of persecution, Rabbi Loew received divine guidance in a dream. He was to create a protector for his people, an artificial man fashioned from clay and animated through sacred rituals. On a moonless night, the rabbi went to the banks of the Vltava River with two trusted assistants. Using mud from the riverbed, they shaped a massive humanoid figure, a giant that would tower over ordinary men. The assistants walked around the clay form 7 times each, reciting mystical incantations. Then Rabbi Loew himself circled the figure 7 times, reciting verses from Genesis, the same words that described how God breathed life into Adam. And just as in that original creation story, the clay figure opened its eyes. The creature was named Yosele, though we know it better by its Hebrew designation, golem. The word appears only once in the Bible, in Psalm 139, where it refers to an unformed or incomplete substance, something raw and unfinished. In Yiddish, the word came to mean something stupid or lethargic, which gives you a sense of how the creature was perceived. Powerful but mindless, strong but not clever. The golem could not speak. It could not think independently. It simply followed its creator's commands with the literal-minded obedience of something that had no inner life of its own. To control the golem, Rabbi Loew used a shem, a piece of parchment or clay tablet inscribed with one of the sacred names of God. Some versions say the shem was placed in the golem's mouth. Others say the rabbi inscribed 3 Hebrew letters directly onto its forehead: Aleph, Mem, and Tav, spelling the word emet, meaning truth. These are significant letters in Hebrew. Aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, Mem is the middle letter, and Tav is the last, symbolizing that truth spans from beginning to end. When the shem was inserted, or the letters inscribed, the golem came to life. When they were removed or altered, it returned to lifeless clay. Think of it as the world's first power switch, except instead of electricity, it ran on divine names and Kabbalistic formulas. And what a worker the golem proved to be. During the day, it performed heavy labor around the ghetto, fetching water from wells, chopping wood, carrying loads that would have exhausted ordinary workers. It never complained, because it could not speak. It never tired, because it was not truly alive in the way humans understand the term. It never needed to eat or sleep. It was, in short, the perfect employee, provided you could overlook the fact that it had glowing eyes and stood about 8 feet tall. Medieval labor relations being what they were, this was apparently not considered a significant drawback. At night, the golem patrolled the streets of the ghetto, protecting its sleeping residents from those who would do them harm. Here was the true purpose of its creation. A guardian that could not be bribed, intimidated, or reasoned with. When attackers came, the golem met them with a strength that no human could match. Swords and clubs were useless against a body made of clay. The creature could appear and disappear, move with surprising speed for something so massive, and fight with the implacable determination of something that had no fear because it had no capacity for fear. Word spread quickly that the Jewish quarter was now defended by something unnatural, and potential attackers began to reconsider their plans. According to some versions of the legend, the golem's intervention extended beyond mere physical protection. It helped expose a plot to frame a Jewish family for blood libel, using its supernatural abilities to catch the real perpetrators. It defended the ghetto during pogroms, scattering mobs with its terrifying appearance alone. For a community that had lived for generations under constant threat, the golem represented something that had never existed before: security. Someone, finally, was on their side. But here is where the legend takes its darker turn. The turn that has made the golem relevant to every subsequent generation worried about the creation slipping beyond human control. Every Friday evening, as the Sabbath approached, Rabbi Lowe would remove the shem from the golem's mouth, rendering it dormant. Jewish law prohibits work on the Sabbath, and this applied even to artificial servants. The golem would stand motionless in a corner, a towering statue of clay, until Saturday evening when its creator would restore the shem and send it back to its duties. One Friday, Rabbi Lowe forgot. Perhaps he was preoccupied with preparations for the Sabbath. Perhaps age was beginning to affect his memory. Whatever the reason, he left the shem in place, and the golem, with no commands to follow and no master to serve, began to act on its own. Without guidance, its behavior became erratic and then violent. It rampaged through the ghetto, smashing buildings, uprooting trees, flinging boulders, destroying the very community it had been created to protect. The guardian had become a monster. Word of the disaster reached Rabbi Lowe as he stood in the Old New Synagogue, leading services and reciting Psalm 92. He interrupted the service immediately, rushed to confront his creation, and managed to remove the shem just before the destruction became total. Some versions say he reached up with a stick to scrape off the first letter from the golem's forehead, changing emet, truth, to met, death. The creature collapsed, transformed back into a lifeless pile of clay. That should have been the end of the story. But the golem, even deactivated, remained a source of unease. Rabbi Lowe did not destroy the clay. Instead, he had the remains carried to the attic of the Old New Synagogue, where they were wrapped in old prayer shawls and left in darkness. The staircase to the attic was torn down. Access was forbidden to all but the rabbi's successors, and even they rarely ventured there. The golem, according to tradition, lies there still, waiting. The Old New Synagogue itself is a remarkable building, the oldest surviving synagogue north of the Alps, dating back to the 13th century. According to one legend, its foundations include stones brought from the original Temple of Jerusalem, which might explain why this particular building has survived so many disasters that destroyed everything around it. It endured fires that ravaged the ghetto. It survived the clearance of the Jewish quarter in the late 19th century, when most of the old structures were demolished to make way for modern boulevards. It even survived the Nazi occupation, though its congregation did not. Today you can visit the synagogue from Parishka Street, and if you look closely, see a small door high up on the wall that leads to the attic. There is no staircase, just a few iron rungs built into the wall. The attic remains sealed. The synagogue's current custodians do not allow visitors. Has anyone ever looked? The answer is yes, with inconclusive result. When the attic was renovated in 1883, workers reportedly found no evidence of any clay remains. In the early 20th century, the journalist Egon Erwin Kisch, a famous Prague writer and contemporary of Franz Kafka, managed to gain access to the attic. He described it as dark and dusty, but made no mention of discovering any ancient guardian slumbering in the shadows. Some versions of the legend address this by claiming the golem was stolen at some point and reburied in the old Jewish cemetery in the Žižkov district, now marked by the Žižkov television tower, Prague's most aggressively ugly modern landmark. Others simply maintain that the golem is still there, invisible to those who lack the spiritual preparation to perceive it. There is also the matter of the Nazi who allegedly tried to enter the attic during World War II and died under mysterious circumstances shortly afterward. This detail has the suspicious quality of a legend created specifically to discourage future investigation, but it fits perfectly into the larger narrative of the golem as a guardian that remains active even in its dormant state, protecting them. synagogue, and by extension the Jewish people, from those who wish them harm. Whether you believe this depends largely on whether you believe in protective curses, sealed attics, and clay giants waiting to be reawakened. The scholarly consensus, for what it is worth, is that Rabbi Lowe almost certainly never created a golem. The earliest written accounts connecting him to the legend date from the 19th century, roughly 200 years after his death. The story appears to be a German literary invention that attached itself to the Maharal's reputation because he was the most famous rabbi in Prague's history. The actual golem legends circulating in Jewish communities during Rabbi Lowe's lifetime were associated with a different rabbi entirely, Elijah of Kelm in Poland. The Prague version displaced the Polish version around 1900, possibly because Prague was more accessible to international audiences, and the Old New Synagogue provided such a compelling physical setting. But historical accuracy has never been the point of the golem legend. Its power lies elsewhere, in the questions it raises about creation, control, and the limits of human authority over what humans make. Consider, the golem was brought into existence for the best possible reasons, to protect innocent people from unjust persecution. Its creator was a wise and righteous man who understood the responsibilities involved. Every precaution was taken, and still, inevitably, catastrophically, things went wrong. One moment of forgetfulness, one failure to properly manage what had been created, and the protector became the destroyer. This is why the golem has remained relevant for over 400 years, long after the specific circumstances that inspired the legend have faded into history. Every generation finds in the golem a mirror for its own anxieties about creation and control. It is probably not a coincidence that the modern word for artificial servants comes from the same part of the world that gave us the golem. In 1921, a Czech playwright named Karel Čapek premiered a play called RUR, short for Rossum's Universal Robots, in Prague. The play introduced the word robot to the world, derived from the Czech word robota, meaning forced labor or servitude, the kind of work that serfs were compelled to perform for their feudal lords. Čapek's robots were not the metallic machines we picture today. They were artificial people, made from synthetic organic matter, designed to perform labor that humans found tedious or dangerous. And like the golem before them, Čapek's robots eventually rebelled, ultimately bringing about the extinction of the human race. Čapek knew the golem legend. It would have been impossible to grow up in Prague and not know it. Scholars have traced direct connections between the two stories. Both feature artificial beings created to serve. Both raise questions about the ethics of creating servants with no choice in their servitude, and both end with the created beings turning against their creators. The word robot even echoes the golem's fundamental nature. Both terms imply creatures defined by their labor, brought into existence not for their own sake, but to serve the purposes of others. From Čapek's robots, the line runs directly to modern artificial intelligence and the debates that now dominate discussions of technology's future. Geoffrey Hinton, often called the godfather of AI, recently warned about the mysteries of modern neural networks, noting that even their creators do not fully understand how they work. This echoes the mystical uncertainty that always surrounded the golem. Rabbi Lowe could bring it to life, but he could not give it a soul, could not make it truly understand, could not predict what it would do without constant supervision. The gap between creation and comprehension, between making something and understanding what you have made, may be the most persistent theme in human technological history. The questions multiply rather than resolve. Can something created by humans develop genuine autonomy? Is there a difference between simulating consciousness and actually possessing it? If we create servants designed to have no will of their own, are we morally responsible for that imposed limitation? And if our creations do develop something like will, something like desire, something like the capacity for independent action, what happens when their goals diverge from ours? The golem had no word for what it experienced as it rampaged through the ghetto. It could not speak, could not explain, could not articulate whether it was acting from rage or confusion or something else entirely. We do not know if it suffered when it was deactivated, if it experienced anything like fear or loss when the shem was removed. We do not even know if experience is a meaningful concept for something made of river mud and divine names. But these are precisely the questions we now ask about artificial intelligences that can generate text, compose music, create images, and hold conversations that feel, to some participants, disturbingly real. Rabbi Lowe's answer, according to the legend, was to seal the golem away rather than destroy it completely. He could not bring himself to unmake what he had made. Perhaps he believed it might be needed again someday. Perhaps he felt some obligation to a being he had brought into existence, even if that being had proven dangerous. Perhaps he simply did not know how to destroy something that had once been alive, if alive is even the right word. The result was an eternal deferral. The problem contained but not resolved. The guardian sleeping but not dead. The questions postponed for future generations to answer. We are those future generations, and we still do not have the answers. What we do have is a remarkable precedent, a story that has been told and retold for centuries, adapted to address each era's particular fears and hopes. The golem has been a protector and a destroyer, a servant and a rebel, a miracle and a warning. It has appeared in novels, films, comic books, and video games. Superman's creators were Jewish immigrants who grew up with golem stories. The superhero as a concept owes something to the clay guardian of Prague. Isaac Asimov's famous 3 Laws of Robotics were an attempt to solve the control problem that Rabbi Lowe solved with a Shem, though the laws proved just as unreliable in fiction as the Shem proved in legend. And now, as we build systems that can learn, adapt, and act in ways their creators did not explicitly program, the golem feels less like folklore and more like prophecy. The sealed attic of the old new synagogue has become a metaphor for all the technologies we have created and do not fully control, all the systems we have set in motion and cannot entirely stop, all the artificial servants we have made in our own image without fully understanding what that image might become. The golem is still waiting. Whether what waits is an ancient pile of clay or a warning about our own future depends entirely on how literally you want to take the story. Speaking of strange things waiting in unexpected places, our journey now takes us from the urban mysticism of Prague to the wild landscapes of the Šumava Mountains, where the forests themselves seem to pulse with unexplained energy. Welcome to the borderlands, where hikers lose time, compasses spin without reason, and some believe that the very rocks and trees remember things that humans have forgotten. From the sealed attic of an ancient synagogue, we now travel to a landscape where the entire earth seems to hide secrets. Welcome to the Šumava, a mountain range older than the Alps, older than the Himalayas, a place where the forests are so dense and the settlements so sparse that locals say the land itself remembers things that humans have forgotten. If Prague is where the mystical history of the Czech Republic was made, Šumava is where that mysticism came from, rising up through ancient stone and primeval forest like breath from the lungs of something very, very old. The Šumava Mountains stretch along the southwestern border of the Czech Republic, forming a natural barrier between Bohemia and the lands of Germany and Austria. The name itself comes from a Proto-Slavic word meaning dense forest, though Czech folk etymology connects it to the word šum, meaning the hum or whisper of wind through trees. Both interpretations are accurate. This is a place of forests so thick that sunlight struggles to reach the ground, where the wind makes sounds that can seem like voices if you listen long enough. The ancient Greeks knew these mountains too. Ptolemy marked them on his maps as Gabretta, a Celtic name, while the geographer Strabo called them Sudeta. The Celts were here first, which is where our story properly begins. 300 million years ago, give or take a few geological epochs, the Šumava began forming. To put that in perspective, when these mountains were young, life on Earth had barely crawled out of the ocean. The dinosaurs would not appear for another 100 million years. The Alps that tourists flock to photograph are geological infants by comparison, having risen a mere 65 million years ago, roughly the same time the dinosaurs were saying their final goodbyes. The Šumava, by contrast, was already ancient when the first mammals scurried through the undergrowth. This is a landscape that has had time to accumulate strangeness the way old houses accumulate dust. The geological age explains some of the region's peculiar characteristics. The Bohemian Massif, of which Šumava forms a part, is riddled with mineral deposits that have shaped both its history and its folklore. Gold was mined in this region for centuries, with the town of Kasperské hory, which translates roughly to Casper's Mountains, serving as a major medieval gold mining center. But gold was not the only treasure hidden in these ancient rocks. The entire Bohemian Massif contains significant deposits of uranium, and while the major mining operations occurred in areas like Yakimov in the Ore Mountains to the north, the radioactive geology extends throughout the region. Some researchers have speculated that these mineral deposits, particularly the uranium and the radon gas it produces, might contribute to the area's reputation for strange phenomena. Radon is colorless and odorless, but can affect human perception in high concentrations. Whether this explains anything or simply provides a convenient scientific-sounding excuse depends largely on what you think needs explaining. The Celts arrived in this region sometime around the 5th century BCE, bringing with them their druids, their rituals, and their remarkable talent for choosing dramatic locations for sacred sites. The tribe that settled here were the Boii, whose name literally gave us the word Bohemia, the ancient name for this part of Central Europe. The Romans called the region Boiohamum, meaning home of the boy, which medieval Latin transformed into Bohemia. Every time you hear the word Bohemian, whether referring to a region, an artistic lifestyle, or a famous rhapsody, you are invoking the memory of Celtic warriors who made these mountains their home 2,500 years ago. The Boii left behind one of the most mysterious archaeological sites in the Czech Republic, Obří hrad, or Giant's Castle. This prehistoric hill fort sits at nearly 1,000 meters altitude, making it the highest fortified settlement in all of Bohemia. The dry stone walls, some of the oldest surviving fortifications in the country, date back to approximately 500 BCE, during the height of Celtic influence in Central Europe. But here is what makes Obří hrad genuinely puzzling. It makes no sense as a military installation. The site is located deep in wild mountains, accessible only after considerable effort, and covered in deep snow for up to 6 months of the year. The walls are configured strangely, with the most heavily fortified sections facing the directions that would have been hardest for attackers to approach anyway, while the more vulnerable approaches were left comparatively undefended. And despite extensive archaeological excavation, almost no everyday objects have been found. No pottery shards, no animal bones, no tools, none of the usual detritus of human habitation. What archaeologists did find was a stone block shaped like a seat or altar, which has led most researchers to conclude that Giant's Castle was not a fortress at all, but a sacred site, a place where the Celts gathered for rituals and ceremonies away from their regular settlements. This would explain the strange defensive layout. The walls were not meant to keep out human armies, but to mark a boundary between the ordinary world and something else. The Celts, like many ancient peoples, believed that certain places were thin, meaning the barrier between our world and the world of spirits was weaker there. These locations required protection of a different kind than military fortifications could provide. Local folklore took the site's name literally. According to legend, Obří hrad was once home to 9 mighty giants who ruled the surrounding mountains. One story tells of a poor tailor who came to the giants, seeking help because he could not support his 10 children. Instead of offering assistance, the giants threw him down a steep slope and hurled a boulder after him. The tailor survived, and when he regained consciousness, he discovered that the boulder was actually a massive chunk of gold. He never had to work again. The moral of the story is unclear. Possibly that giants are terrible at customer service but excellent at accidental charity. Or possibly that the mountains reward those who survive their cruelty. Either way, the legend connects the site to gold, which is interesting given the actual gold deposits in the nearby region. Fast forward about 2,000 years, and the Šumava had become the domain of a very different kind of human settlement. During the medieval period, German-speaking colonists cleared portions of the forest, establishing villages whose names still reflect their origins in forest clearance. For centuries, the region maintained a distinct Germanic character within the Czech lands, a population that would be almost entirely expelled after World War II, following the horrors of Nazi occupation. But the 20th century brought an even stranger fate to the Šumava. When the Iron Curtain descended across Europe after 1945, this mountain range found itself on the front line of the Cold War. The border between communist Czechoslovakia and capitalist West Germany ran directly through these forests, and the entire region was transformed into a militarized zone. Villages were evacuated, populations forcibly relocated, and vast stretches of the mountains were declared off-limits to ordinary citizens. Watchtowers were built, barbed wire was strung, and soldiers patrolled trails that had once been used by pilgrims and traders. For 40 years, the Šumava was one of the most heavily guarded and least visited places in Europe. The forests grew back over abandoned farms. Wildlife reclaimed territory that had been human for centuries. And something strange happened. The enforced emptiness preserved the landscape in a way that nowhere else in Central Europe could match. When the Velvet Revolution ended communist rule in 1989 and the borders opened, ecologists discovered that the Šumava contained some of the last intact ecosystems on the continent. The very militarization that had been meant to prevent escape had inadvertently created a nature preserve. In 1990, UNESCO designated the region a biosphere reserve. The following year, it became the Czech Republic's largest national park. But the decades of isolation had another effect. With almost no human presence, the Šumava became a place where stories accumulated without witnesses to confirm or deny them. Border guards reported strange lights moving through the forests. Radar stations occasionally tracked objects that did not behave like any known aircraft. And locals who had lived on the edges of the forbidden zone told tales of things seen in the distance that they could not explain. Czechoslovakia, and later the Czech Republic, developed a surprisingly active UFO research community, particularly after the fall of communism allowed such topics to be discussed openly. The Zaja Project, which translates to Project Glow, has collected reports of unidentified aerial phenomena from across the country for decades. Their findings are intriguing. About 40% of reported sightings can be definitively explained as aircraft, satellites, weather phenomena, or other known causes. A little over 50% are closed due to insufficient evidence, meaning the investigators simply cannot determine what was seen. But 2 to 10% of cases, depending on the year, remain genuinely unexplained, even after thorough investigation. The border regions, including the Šumava, feature prominently in these unexplained cases. Some researchers have suggested that the mineral-rich geology attracts whatever these phenomena are. Others point out that remote, sparsely populated areas naturally generate more unexplained sightings simply because there are fewer witnesses and less infrastructure to identify conventional explanations. The skeptical view holds that humans see what they expect to see, and decades of Cold War anxiety primed observers to interpret ambiguous phenomena as something sinister. But the truly strange reports predate the Cold War, and even the modern UFO era. Local folklore from the Šumava is filled with accounts of lights in the forest that lead travelers astray, of figures seen at twilight that dissolve when approached, of sounds that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The Celts apparently considered this entire mountain range spiritually significant, not just specific sites like Obří. Medieval chroniclers recorded stories of forest spirits who protected travelers or punished those who violated the mountain's unwritten laws. The Germans who settled here brought their own folklore of the wild hunt, spectral riders who swept through the sky on certain nights of the year. Among the most sacred locations in the modern Šumava is the Bubinski prales, the Bubin primeval forest. This patch of ancient woodland, protected since 1858, represents what much of Europe looked like before humans started cutting down trees. The forest contains spruces, firs, and beeches that are 300 to 400 years old, with trunks twisted into bizarre shapes and roots entangled in patterns that seem almost deliberate. Walking through the Bubin forest is like stepping back in time, not centuries, but millennia, to an era when the boundary between the wild and the civilized was absolute, and the wild was winning. The trees in primeval forests do not grow the way trees in managed woodlands grow. Without humans removing fallen logs or clearing underbrush, the forest develops its own architecture. Dead trees stand for decades, slowly rotting into columns of soft wood that support entire ecosystems of fungi, insects, and small mammals. Fallen giants become nurseries for new growth, their decomposing mass providing nutrients for seedlings that would otherwise struggle to survive on the poor mountain soil. The result is a landscape that feels designed by something with very different aesthetic priorities than human landscapers. Scientists have documented unusual electromagnetic phenomena in old-growth forests, likely caused by the interaction between dense vegetation, underground water, and the mineral content of the soil. Whether these phenomena explain the feelings of unease that many visitors report, or whether the unease has deeper causes, remains open to interpretation. What is certain is that humans evolved in landscapes very different from primeval forests, and our instincts still register these environments as places where predators might lurk, and dangers might emerge without warning. The fear is probably vestigial, a leftover from ancestors who had very good reasons to be nervous in deep woods. Or possibly the fear is appropriate, and we have simply forgotten what justified it. The Šumava also contains several glacial lakes, bodies of water formed during the last ice age that carry wonderfully ominous names. Černé jezero, Black Lake, is the largest and deepest lake in the Czech part of the mountains. Its waters appear black due to the reflection of the surrounding dark forest, creating a mirror effect that can be genuinely unsettling on overcast days. Nearby sits Čertovo jezero, Devil's Lake, whose name requires no translation or explanation. These lakes are beautiful in the way that a tiger is beautiful. You can appreciate them aesthetically while being acutely aware that you probably should not get too close. Local legends claim that the lakes are bottomless, which is geologically false but emotionally true. Standing at the edge of Black Lake on a misty morning, with the forest pressing in from all sides and the water reflecting nothing but darkness, it is very easy to believe that the lake goes down forever. It is easy to believe many things in the Shumava that would seem ridiculous in a modern city. The mountains have that effect on people. Today, the Shumava is accessible to visitors in ways that would have been impossible during the Cold War era. Hiking trails crisscross the national park. Cyclists follow designated routes through the forests. Tourists photograph the glacial lakes and wonder at the primeval forest. But even now, large sections of the mountains remain protected zones where human access is restricted. The wilderness that the military accidentally preserved continues to be preserved, this time deliberately. And the stories continue too. Hikers still report experiences they cannot explain. Lights that move against the wind, sounds that seem to come from underground, feelings of being watched by something that remains invisible. The mineral-rich geology still produces radon and other gases. The ancient forests still grow in patterns that human minds struggle to process. The Celtic sacred sites still stand, their original purpose unknown and possibly unknowable. Whether any of this constitutes evidence of the supernatural, evidence of unusual natural phenomena, or simply evidence of the human capacity for imagination in unfamiliar environments, depends on what you are willing to believe. The Shumava does not provide answers. It merely provides a landscape old enough and strange enough that almost any question seems reasonable to ask. Speaking of questions without easy answers, our next chapter takes us from geological anomalies to agricultural ones. The Czech Republic has experienced its share of crop circle appearances, those mysterious patterns in fields that skeptics attribute to pranksters and believers attribute to something considerably more exotic. Welcome to the flattened weed of Bohemia. From the primeval forests and glacial lakes of the Shumava, we now turn to the skies above them. Because while the mountains themselves hold ancient mysteries, what has been seen floating above those mountains in recent decades makes even the Celtic legends of giants seem almost quaint by comparison. Welcome to the chapter where things get genuinely strange, where trained military pilots describe objects that behave like nothing in their experience, where ordinary villagers report phenomena that sound like scenes from science fiction, and where the Czech Republic reveals itself as one of Europe's most active hotspots for unidentified aerial phenomena. The Czech relationship with UFOs is, like so many Czech things, complicated. This is one of the least religious nations in Europe, a country where surveys consistently show that the majority of the population identifies as atheist or agnostic. Czechs pride themselves on their skepticism, their practicality, their resistance to being fooled. They burned fortune-telling books in Prague to mock an apocalypse prediction. They treat claims of the supernatural with the kind of cool reserve that makes a Swiss banker look emotional. And yet, paradoxically, or perhaps precisely because of this skepticism, Czech UFO reports tend to be unusually credible. When Czech witnesses describe something strange, they do so reluctantly, knowing they will be mocked, knowing their culture provides no comfortable religious or supernatural framework to explain their experience. They report what they saw because they saw it, not because they wanted to. The numbers are striking. The Prague Observatory alone receives around 100 calls per year from people reporting unexplained aerial phenomena. For a country of 10 million people, that is an extraordinarily high rate, especially when compared to the United Kingdom, which has 6 times the population but only marginally more reported sightings. The Zara Project, which translates as Project Glow, has been investigating Czech UFO reports for decades with a methodology that balances open-mindedness with rigorous skepticism. Their findings are intriguing. Approximately 40% of reported sightings can be definitively explained as aircraft, satellites, meteors, planets, or even particularly enthusiastic disco lights reflecting off clouds. Another 50% or so cannot be explained simply because there is insufficient evidence, meaning the investigators cannot determine what was seen, but cannot rule out mundane explanations either. And then there are the remaining cases, somewhere between 2 and 10% depending on the year, that remain genuinely unexplained even after thorough investigation. Objects that do not match any known aircraft. Phenomena that behave in ways that contradict understood physics. Things that remain, in the original sense of the term, unidentified. The most famous Czech UFO incident occurred not in the Shumava, but over the Vranov Reservoir in southern Moravia, on a summer afternoon in 1987. The shores of the reservoir were crowded with vacationers enjoying the July warmth when military radar detected an unknown object moving toward Czechoslovak airspace from Austria. A helicopter crew from the 51st Regiment was scrambled to intercept. What followed reads like a scene from a movie that would be rejected by studio executives for being too implausible. The helicopter crew, consisting of 3 experienced military officers, climbed to 2,000 meters and began tracking the target. At first, they assumed the radar was simply tracking a cloud, which is embarrassing, but does happen. Then they saw it, a black object shaped like an airplane without wings, moving through the sky in ways that no airplane should move. Air traffic control gave the order to engage and destroy the target. The pilots attempted to get the object in their sights, but every time they maneuvered into firing position, the target changed direction with impossible precision. Even stranger, it always maneuvered toward the sun, making visual tracking extremely difficult. The object seemed aware of what the helicopter was doing and countered each move perfectly. Firing was also complicated by the fact that the target hovered directly over the reservoir, which was full of civilians. Shooting missiles at an unknown object above hundreds of swimmers is not standard military procedure, even in the most aggressive air forces. After approximately 2 minutes of visual contact, the object disappeared into a cloud. The helicopter crew continued their pursuit, flying on instruments through the cloud cover, while ground control continued tracking the target on radar. Then came what the crew later described as the worst moment of the entire flight. Ground control began providing distance updates. Target 6 kilometers enclosing, 4 kilometers, 2 kilometers, directly at you. The object was flying straight toward the helicopter at tremendous speed. The crew had to execute emergency evasive maneuvers to avoid a collision with something they could not see, but that radar confirmed was real and heading directly for them. After the near collision, the object accelerated to what the crew later calculated, based on radar data and timestamps, to be approximately 2,700 kilometers per hour, well into supersonic territory. It streaked across Moravia, passed over the city of Brno, continued toward the Jaslovské Bohunice nuclear power plant, and eventually disappeared from radar somewhere near Bratislava. No aircraft in any military inventory in 1987 could have matched that performance profile. Combining the ability to hover motionless with sudden acceleration to supersonic speeds while maintaining the maneuverability to outfly a trained military crew. When the helicopter landed, the crew received orders to destroy all records of radio correspondence and flight parameters. This instruction, naturally, only increased speculation about what had actually happened. The incident might have disappeared into classified military archives forever, except that details eventually emerged through the testimony of the crew members themselves, some of whom were willing to discuss what they had experienced once the communist regime fell and the culture of secrecy began to relax. But the Vranov incident, dramatic as it was, is far from the only significant Czech UFO case. The small town of Milicin, located south of Prague, has earned the informal title of the Czech Roswell due to the sheer concentration of reported sightings in and around the municipality since 1991. The phenomenon began on July 12th of that year, when residents observed a glowing spherical object hovering in the night sky. Unlike conventional aircraft, the sphere moved silently and unpredictably, drifting through the town in ways that seemed almost purposeful. Some witnesses reported that the object followed people as they walked, maintaining a constant distance, regardless of how fast or in what direction they moved. The experience was, understandably, terrifying. The Milicin sphere was allegedly witnessed by hundreds of people over multiple nights, though only a fraction were willing to speak publicly about what they had seen. Czech cultural skepticism cuts both ways. It makes people reluctant to invent stories, but it also makes them reluctant to admit seeing things that others might ridicule. Several witnesses reported seeing the outlines of figures inside the glowing sphere, humanoid shapes that seemed to be observing the town. In at least one account, these figures allegedly left the sphere and were seen moving on the roof of an empty cottage, apparently examining or repairing something. The witness claimed they left behind footprints in the mud, larger than human prints and showing only 4 digits. The local pastor, rather than encouraging his congregation to report what they had seen, reportedly told them to keep quiet about the incident, characterizing it as perhaps a divine miracle that should not be discussed. Whether this was genuine religious interpretation, an attempt to prevent panic, or simply a practical response to an inexplicable situation, remains unclear. What is clear is that the sightings continued intermittently for years, with the glowing orange sphere apparently returning to Milicin in 2015. Today, the town has embraced its strange reputation. Small aliens are painted on public buildings. The municipal website mentions the history of encounters. Milicin has become a minor tourist destination for Czech UFO enthusiasts, which is not exactly the development most town councils anticipate when planning their economic futures. The wave of sightings that swept across the Czech Republic in the early 1990s coincided with, and was perhaps enabled by, the fall of communism. Under the old regime, reporting UFO sightings was effectively impossible. There was no one to report them to, no organization tracking such phenomena, and speaking publicly about extraterrestrial possibilities was implicitly discouraged. When the communist system collapsed in 1989, the restrictions vanished as well. Suddenly, Czechs could talk about what they had seen, and many did. Sightings that might have been suppressed or ignored for decades emerged into public discussion. New tabloid newspapers, freed from state censorship, splashed UFO stories across their front pages. The Czech Archaeoastronomical Association, founded in the early 1990s, began receiving reports at rates that seemed almost impossible. 40 per month, over 350 per year, far more than could be explained by misidentified aircraft or weather phenomena. The shapes and behaviors reported varied enormously. Witnesses described brilliant orange spheres, cigar-shaped objects without wings, glowing triangles, silvery balls that moved in zigzag patterns, and in one memorable case, something that looked like a giant eye with a small window in it. A 1993 article in an American newspaper quoted Czech witnesses describing a 1,500-foot-long silver boomerang with red and green lights at its wingtips, and, most remarkably, an enormous orb containing what appeared to be a 9-foot-tall dog. Whether that last report was genuine, a mistranslation, or simply the result of very strong Czech beer remains uncertain. The military continued to encounter unexplained objects as well. In May 1992, radar stations detected an unknown aircraft entering Czech airspace from Germany, traveling at over 200 kilometers per hour. The object remained in Czech airspace for approximately 45 minutes, long enough to be tracked by multiple radar installations and spotted visually by witnesses in the town of Tři. Fighter jets and helicopters were scrambled to intercept. All interception attempts failed. The object seemed to anticipate and evade every approach. No official explanation was ever provided, and the incident remains classified or simply unresolved. In August 1993, a resident of the town of Borova encountered something while walking his dog that defied easy categorization. The object was small, only about 70 centimeters long and 40 to 50 centimeters high, resembling a flatfish without a tail. It hovered motionless approximately 30 centimeters above the road, making no sound whatsoever. As the witness watched, the object began to move, gliding silently through the air before disappearing. The following day, UFO sightings erupted across multiple locations throughout the Czech Republic, with witnesses describing a variety of shapes, from cigar-like craft to glowing triangles. Whether these were related phenomena or simply coincidental timing remains unknown. More recently, in November 2016, a group of 6 or 7 witnesses observed a dark triangular object hovering silently in the sky just outside Prague during sunset. The craft emitted no lights, made no sound, and showed no visible propulsion system. It remained motionless for several minutes, then ascended vertically and vanished. Prague has some of the densest air traffic in Central Europe, both commercial and military. Every major airport and airbase has radar coverage, and yet no official explanation emerged. No radar data was released, and the sighting remains unexplained. The concentration of sightings in and around the Šumava region has led some researchers to speculate about a connection between the area's unusual geology and the phenomenon. The Bohemian Massif contains significant deposits of uranium, gold, and other minerals. Radon gas seeps through the ancient rock in concentrations that can affect human perception. The region was heavily militarized during the Cold War, which means extensive radar coverage and heightened awareness of aerial phenomena. Any or all of these factors might contribute to the elevated reporting rates. Or perhaps there is something genuinely unusual about the Šumava that attracts phenomena we do not yet understand. International investigators have taken notice. Czech cases appear in global databases of unexplained aerial phenomena. The patterns observed here, objects near nuclear facilities, craft that outperform known aircraft, multiple witnesses describing consistent details, match patterns observed in other countries. Whatever is happening in Czech skies is not unique to the Czech Republic, but the Czech reports are notable for their quality and the credibility of their witnesses. Military officers, civilian authorities, and ordinary citizens have all contributed accounts that resist easy explanation. The question, of course, is what any of this means. The vast majority of UFO researchers maintain appropriately agnostic positions. They do not claim to know what these objects are, only that they exist and that they behave in ways that current science cannot explain. The extraterrestrial hypothesis, the idea that these are craft from other worlds, remains exactly that, a hypothesis, not a proven fact. But the alternative explanations, secret military technology, atmospheric phenomena, mass hallucination, hoaxes, also fail to account for all the observed data. Something is happening in Czech skies. What that something is remains, for now, genuinely unidentified. And so we come to the end of our journey through mystical Bohemia, a journey that has taken us from meteor impacts to medieval fortresses, from Nazi occult experiments to alchemical laboratories, from the sealed attic of a synagogue to the primeval, forests of mountains older than memory, and finally to the strange lights that dance across Czech skies in defiance of explanation. The question that remains is perhaps the most difficult one. Why here? Why should this small Central European nation, landlocked and historically insignificant on the global stage, be such a concentrated point of mysterious phenomena? The theories are numerous, and none of them can be proven. But they are worth considering, if only because they suggest patterns that extend far beyond the Czech Republic itself. One theory focuses on nuclear geography. The Bohemian Massif contains some of the oldest and most significant uranium deposits in Europe. The mines at Yakimov supplied the radium that Marie Curie used in her Nobel Prize-winning research. During the Cold War, Czech uranium fueled the Soviet nuclear program, and researchers have long noted a statistical correlation between UFO sightings and proximity to nuclear facilities. A 2015 French study found that unexplained aerial phenomena cluster around atomic sites to a statistically significant degree. The Czech Republic, with its uranium geology and its historical position on the front line of the Cold War, fits this pattern precisely. Some UFO researchers have speculated that whatever intelligence operates these unidentified craft has a specific interest in nuclear technology, perhaps out of concern for its destructive potential, perhaps for reasons we cannot imagine. Multiple military witnesses worldwide have reported UFO activity near nuclear missile silos, nuclear power plants, and nuclear weapons storage facilities. In several cases, witnesses claim that nuclear weapon systems malfunctioned or went offline during UFO encounters. Whether this represents deliberate interference, accidental electromagnetic effects, or simple coincidence remains unknown. But if there is a pattern, the Czech Republic, with its concentrated uranium deposits and its proximity to nuclear facilities across Central Europe, would be exactly the kind of place where such phenomena might concentrate. Another theory focuses on water. The Šumava region is one of the most important watersheds in Central Europe. Rivers flow from these mountains to the North Sea and the Black Sea. Glacial lakes dot the landscape. Peat bogs store vast quantities of groundwater. And recent research has noted a curious pattern in global UFO reports. A significant number of sightings occur near large bodies of water, with some objects appearing to enter or emerge from the water itself. The term USO, unidentified submersible object, has entered the vocabulary of researchers who study these phenomena. If water is somehow significant to whatever these objects are, whether as a resource, a habitat, or simply a point of interest, then the water-rich landscape of the Czech highlands would naturally attract attention. A third theory is more speculative still, touching on ideas that most scientists would dismiss as pseudoscience, but that persist in certain research communities nonetheless. This theory suggests that certain locations on Earth are somehow different, places where the normal rules of physics are slightly more flexible, where the barriers between dimensions or realities are thinner than elsewhere. The concept appears in folklore worldwide: fairy mounds, spirit paths, thin places where the other world bleeds through into ours. The Celts who built the mysterious hill forts of the Šumava apparently believed they were constructing barriers against something, fortifications that made no military sense but that marked boundaries between the ordinary world and something else. Whether this reflects genuine insight or simply the human tendency to find meaning in landscapes we do not understand is, of course, impossible to determine. What is certain is that the Czech Republic possesses a remarkable concentration of phenomena that resist easy explanation. We have walked through this landscape together, encountering stories that range from the merely unusual to the genuinely bizarre. The meteor that supposedly shaped the region's consciousness. The fortress at Huska, built not to keep enemies out, but to seal something in. The Nazi experiments that combined cutting-edge technology with medieval occultism. The alchemists who sought to transmute lead into gold while simultaneously laying the foundations for modern astronomy. The golem that protected Prague's Jewish community until its power became too dangerous to control. The primeval forests that have grown undisturbed for thousands of years, developing their own strange architecture. The lights in the sky that military jets cannot catch and radar cannot explain. Some of these stories have prosaic explanations. The Huska fortress was probably built for defensive purposes that made sense in its historical context, regardless of later legends. The Nazi occult experiments were likely more theatrical than effective, a product of ideology run amok rather than genuine supernatural engagement. The golem is almost certainly a literary creation, a story that accrued around a historical figure who never claimed such powers. Even the UFO sightings might eventually be explained by atmospheric phenomena, secret military technology, or patterns of human perception that we do not yet understand. But some of these stories resist explanation, even when we apply all the tools of modern skepticism. The behavior of the object over the Vranov Reservoir in 1987, tracked on military radar, observed by trained pilots, performing maneuvers that no known aircraft can match, does not fit neatly into any category. The consistent reports from hundreds of witnesses in Milichin over multiple years cannot be easily dismissed as mass hysteria or attention-seeking. The statistical correlation between unexplained phenomena and nuclear sites appears in data from multiple countries, suggesting something more than coincidence. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is simply that we do not know. We do not know whether extraterrestrial intelligence has visited Earth. We do not know whether dimensions beyond our normal perception intersect with our reality in certain locations. We do not know whether the universe contains phenomena that our current physics cannot describe. What we do know is that the Czech Republic, this small nation at the heart of Europe, has accumulated an unusual number of stories that point toward mysteries we cannot yet solve. The Czechs themselves, characteristically, maintain their skepticism while acknowledging the data. They do not believe easily, but they do not dismiss easily either. They investigate, they document, they analyze, and they admit when they cannot explain what they have found. It is perhaps the ideal approach to phenomena that challenge our understanding. Neither credulity nor denial, but persistent, careful inquiry. Our journey through mystical Bohemia ends here, but the mysteries themselves continue. New sightings are reported every year. New researchers examine old cases with fresh methodologies. New technologies might eventually allow us to detect and document phenomena that previous generations could only describe in imperfect human terms. The Czech Republic remains what it has always been, a crossroads, a border zone, a place where different worlds meet and sometimes overlap. Whether those worlds are geological, historical, or something stranger still, Bohemia continues to guard its secrets. Thank you for traveling with us through this landscape of legend and unexplained reality. The forests of the Šumava still whisper in the wind. The spires of Prague still rise against the sky. The lights still appear, hovering above mountains and reservoirs and ancient Celtic ruins, waiting for someone to finally understand what they are and why they have come.